You know, those online debates about the Oxford study and interracial marriage. It seems like everyone's got a hot take, but what's the real story? You wanted to cut through the noise, get to the research, and that's what we're doing.
Yeah, it's definitely a lightning rod topic, and I think often misunderstood.
Totally. But before we go any further, we should probably clear something up for our listeners.
Okay.
The Oxford study that everyone keeps mentioning, it's not actually a formal study at all.
You're right, it's true. What we're really looking at is a 2010 article by Balaji and Chanthapan, and their work isn't about, crunching numbers on actual interracial relationships.
Right.
It's more an analysis of how Asian American women and their relationships with white men are portrayed in the media.
So it's more about representation than like real-life experiences.
Exactly. And that's part of where these kind of harmful stereotypes can take root.
Yeah, that's a really important distinction for us to make right off the bat.
Absolutely.
Because I think it's really easy to see how people would get those two things confused.
For sure.
But before we unpack the stereotypes, let's actually look at some hard data on interracial marriage trends in America. The Pew Research Center has done a ton of fascinating work in this area, and I think some of their findings might surprise people.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I think one of the most striking findings that jumps out at you when you look at this research is that Asian women have a way higher outmarriage rate compared to Asian men.
Okay.
We're talking almost 40% of Asian women marry outside their racial group compared to like roughly 20% of Asian men.
Wow.
And this gap has actually been widening since 1980.
Oh, wow. So that's a pretty stark contrast. What do you think is driving that difference?
I think to understand it, we have to sort of like zoom out and look at the historical context a little bit.
Okay.
Thinking about the early patterns of immigration to the U.S., for example, Asian men and women faced very different restrictions and opportunities,
Right.
which, of course, had this huge impact on their options for marriage, even within their own communities.
You're talking about things like the Chinese Exclusion Act and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And those historical injustices don't just disappear overnight.
Right.
Their legacy kind of seeps into our cultural attitudes and our perceptions in ways that maybe we don't even realize sometimes. It's fascinating to see how these historical patterns still resonate in our present-day demographics.
Yeah, totally. So it's not just about personal preference. There's like all this history kind of baked into these trends.
Yeah.
Okay. So we know Asian women have a high outmarriage rate, but who are they most likely to marry when they do marry out?
So the data shows that when Asian women marry out, it's most frequently with white partners.
Okay.
And here's another interesting little tidbit. White individuals actually have the lowest outmarriage rate overall, less than 10% according to Pew. It's like these two sides of the same coin.
That's so interesting. So you've got Asian women with a high outmarriage rate, mostly with white partners, while white individuals are the least likely to marry out of their own group.
Yeah.
What is contributing to that pattern?
That's the million-dollar question. I mean, we can't ignore the very real possibility that these individual choices are happening within a system where certain groups are still very much, privileged over others.
Right. It's not like these are individual choices happening in some sort of vacuum.
Right.
These trends are all playing out against this backdrop of all these historical and cultural forces that shape our perceptions, even when we're not aware of it.
Absolutely. And that's why I think it's so important to understand where other racial groups sort of fit into this whole picture.
Right.
When we look at Black and Latinx individuals, for example, it really helps us paint a more complete picture of what's going on here.
Okay, so let's talk about that. What are the trends for those groups? What does it look like?
Well, when we look at Black individuals who marry out, about 60% do so with white partners. And for Latinx individuals, it's a similar pattern, a significant portion choosing non-Hispanic white partners.
Okay.
And I think this really highlights a critical trend that goes beyond any single racial or ethnic group.
Okay.
This tendency to marry into the dominant racial group.
That's such an interesting observation.
Yeah.
So it's like we can't divorce these interracial marriage patterns from these larger power dynamics that still exist in our society. It's not just about love, it's about history. It's about representation and how those forces influence who we even see as a potential partner.
You took the words right out of my mouth.
Yeah.
And remember, those perceptions have been shaped by generations of laws and policies and cultural narratives that very much favor some groups over others.
Right. Okay, so we've got this really complex web of history, demographics, societal influence, but we haven't really unpacked the why behind these trends. What are some of the other factors that could be at play here?
Well, for example, there are geographical variations. Intermarriage rates are way higher on the West Coast compared to the South, for example.
That makes sense. The West Coast just tends to be a lot more diverse and potentially more open to interracial relationships than other parts of the country.
Right. And then there's the influence of education and income. Research actually suggests that interracial couples, particularly those with white and Asian spouses, tend to have higher levels of education and income compared to same-race couples.
So socioeconomic factors could be playing a role too. Like maybe people with higher education levels are just more likely to be in situations where they meet and form relationships with people from different backgrounds.
It's a possibility. And, we can't forget about the cultural and psychological factors that are at play here, too.
Right.
Psychotherapist Joel Krohn suggests that for some people, intermarriage can actually be a way of kind of reconciling their own complex feelings about their own cultural identity.
That's so interesting. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Because I'm sure our listeners are as curious about that as I am.
Sure. So imagine someone who feels caught between two cultures.
Okay.
Maybe they're a second-generation American. They're trying to balance their family's heritage with their experience of growing up in a completely different culture.
Right.
And for some people in that position, intermarriage could be a way of bridging that gap, finding a partner who understands and appreciates both sides of who they are.
Yeah, so it's almost like choosing a partner who kind of reflects that multifaceted nature of their own background.
Exactly. And this idea also ties into this concept of assimilation.
Right.
How different groups kind of navigate the process of integrating into a new society.
Right.
For some people, intermarriage might be seen as this path toward acceptance, a way of fitting in.
But of course, assimilation looks different for everybody. It's not like a one-size-fits-all experience.
Oh, absolutely.
And it comes with its own set of challenges and compromises, for sure.
You're absolutely right. And I think that's something that's really important for us to keep in mind as we kind of unpack these trends, is to avoid making generalizations and to really acknowledge that diversity of experience within any racial or ethnic group.
Totally. So it's like we're trying to put together this giant, complex puzzle of interracial marriage in America. We've got all these different pieces, historical context, demographics, cultural influences, and we're trying to see how they all fit together to make the bigger picture.
Exactly. And, with any social issue, this multifaceted, there's never going to be just one right answer.
Right.
What's important is that we're asking the questions, we're engaging with the data, and we're considering these different perspectives in a way that's nuanced and thoughtful.
Absolutely. But we would be remiss if we didn't talk about the elephant in the room, how this Oxford study has been kind of twisted and misinterpreted to fit certain narratives sometimes with harmful consequences.
Right. And this is where we need to be incredibly careful. While it might not have been the author's intention, this study has become this breeding ground for racist and sexist views, often reinforcing the very stereotypes that it aims to analyze.
Right. We're talking about those really harmful, dehumanizing stereotypes like the submissive Asian woman, this fetishization of Asian women as exotic or subservient ideas that really pit women of color against each other. It's incredibly damaging.
And it's important to remember that these stereotypes don't exist in a vacuum.
Right.
They're rooted in a long and painful history of colonialism, Orientalism, the hypersexualization of Asian women in Western media and culture.
It's like those historical power imbalances are still casting a shadow on the way we talk about interracial relationships even today.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so dangerous to reduce individuals to these very simplistic and frankly offensive stereotypes.
Right.
It completely disregards their agency, their individual experiences, and the complex realities of their relationships.
Yeah, it's dehumanizing.
Absolutely.
And it's something that we need to be actively pushing back against.
I completely agree.
Yeah.
Because, words have power. And when we perpetuate these harmful stereotypes, even unintentionally, we contribute to a culture where people feel judged, objectified, reduced to a caricature of who they are.
And that can have a devastating impact on people. Imagine being told that your relationship isn't valid, that your partner's choice is based on some warped stereotype instead of a genuine connection. That must be so incredibly hurtful.
It creates a chilling effect on open and honest dialogue about race and relationships, too. When people are afraid to speak their truth for fear of being judged or stereotyped, it prevents us from having these difficult but necessary conversations.
Instead of talking with each other, we end up talking at each other.
Precisely.
And that gets us nowhere. So how do we move forward in a way that's both intellectually honest and respectful of everybody's individual experiences?
Right. That's the million-dollar question.
Because even though the Oxford study itself might not be what a lot of people think it is, it's touched a nerve.
Yeah.
It sparked all these important, even if sometimes messy, conversations about race and relationships and identity in America.
And those conversations are crucial, even when they're uncomfortable. Because if we shy away from these topics, we allow ignorance and prejudice to just fester.
So how do we engage with this topic in a way that's constructive, not destructive? What are some things we can do? What are some things we can keep in mind?
Well, I think a good starting point is to approach this whole thing with a lot of humility.
Mm.
None of us has all the answers, and it's okay to acknowledge that this is a complex, nuanced issue with no easy solutions.
Right. It's about being open to learning, challenging our own biases, and recognizing the beautiful diversity of human experiences.
It's also about really listening to understand rather than listening to respond.
Yes.
And especially listening to the voices of those who have been historically marginalized and misrepresented in these conversations.
That's so important. Like, we can't dismantle these harmful narratives if we're not even willing to listen to the people who are most impacted by them.
Exactly. And, I think it's also important to remember the difference between individual experiences and larger societal trends.
Okay.
Just because someone chooses to marry interracially doesn't mean they're somehow immune to the very real influences of systemic racism or cultural conditioning.
Right. We can't ignore the context.
Exactly.
The fact that these choices are being made within a system that still privileges some groups over others.
100%. And that's where the real work is.
Yeah.
It's not enough to simply acknowledge that these disparities exist.
Yeah.
We have to actively challenge and dismantle the systems that perpetuate them.
So in a way, these interracial marriage trends are like this really interesting mirror reflecting both the progress that we made as a society and also how much further we still have to go.
Precisely. And that brings us back to the heart of this whole deep dive. What can we actually learn from this so-called Oxford study and the conversations it sparked?
Right, because at the end of the day, it's not about statistics. It's about real people, real relationships, and the evolution of identity in America.
And that's something worth talking about.
Yeah, it's like we're looking at ourselves in one of those distorted funhouse mirrors. You know, the ones I'm talking about. It really makes you think about how we see ourselves and each other when it comes to race and relationships and this idea of belonging.
That's true. And just like a funhouse mirror, it kind of forces us to confront those distortions, those warped perceptions. And then we have to ask ourselves, why? Why do things look this way? And what would a more accurate reflection even look like? How do we find that?
Okay, I really like where you're going with this. So as we start to wrap up our deep dive today into the whole Oxford study and all these interracial marriage trends, is there one thing you really hope our listeners will walk away thinking about?
I think the most important thing is to remember that this isn't just some, intellectual exercise. It's not just about statistics or debating data points. These are conversations that have very real implications for how we treat each other every single day, how we build relationships with each other, and how we create a society that's truly inclusive and equitable for everyone.
It's about remembering that those statistics are actually real people.
Right.
With their own unique stories and journeys.
Absolutely. Every single data point represents a human life with a complex web of experiences and choices and dreams. And I think that's easy to lose sight of sometimes in these kinds of discussions.
Absolutely. So as interracial marriage rates keep going up and our society becomes even more diverse, what kind of questions does all of this raise for us about identity, about belonging, about the future of relationships here?
That's a great question. And it's a big one. It challenges us to really rethink a lot of those old ideas we have about race,
Okay.
about culture, and about what it even means to be a part of a community.
Right. Like, are we heading towards a more fluid understanding of identity, one where maybe race starts to become less important in how we define ourselves and each other?
I think that's definitely a possibility. And as these interracial relationships become more and more common, it's going to be fascinating to see how they continue to kind of reshape and redefine our cultural landscape.
It's like we're watching this slow but steady kind of evolution of how we understand ourselves and where we fit in.
It really is. Yeah. And I think it highlights how important it is for all of us to approach these conversations, especially when we're talking about sensitive topics like race and identity, with a sense of curiosity, with empathy, and with a genuine willingness to challenge those assumptions we all have.
Because at the end of the day, that's how we learn, how we grow, how we evolve, both as individuals and as a society.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah. And on that note, we're going to leave you with one final thought to ponder. If those rising interracial marriage rates tell us anything, it's that love really can transcend even the most deeply ingrained social boundaries. And honestly, I think that's something worth celebrating. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. It really makes you think about how much all this stuff is connected, you know? Like our own personal choices about love and marriage, they're not happening in a vacuum. They're actually being shaped by these big social forces that we might not even be aware of.
It's so true. And I think that's the power of really taking a deep dive into a topic like this.
Yeah.
You start to see those hidden connections between our own lives and the bigger picture. It
Yeah,
can be pretty eye-opening.
totally. So before we wrap things up, I'm curious to get your take on something. If these interracial marriage trends are anything to go by, it seems like the future of relationships in America is going to look pretty different from the past. What are your thoughts on that?
We know it's important to acknowledge that just because interracial relationships are becoming more visible doesn't mean that all the challenges have magically disappeared.
Yeah.
We're still grappling with things like systemic racism and implicit bias in so many areas of life.
Right. It's not like a guarantee of a perfect utopia or anything.
Exactly. These trends don't mean that prejudice and discrimination have just vanished. They just mean that people are finding ways to connect and build relationships across those traditional boundaries. I think that's a real testament to the power of love,
Yeah.
and resilience, and this very human need for connection.
I love that. It's like we're seeing this push for a more inclusive idea of what love and family can look like.
Exactly. And as those definitions continue to kind of broaden and evolve, it's really going to challenge a lot of those deeply held assumptions that we have about identity, about belonging, about what it means to be part of a community.
It's kind of exciting to imagine what that could mean for future generations.
It really is. And I think it really underscores how important it is to have these conversations with our friends, with our families and our communities. Because the more we understand these complex dynamics, the better equipped we'll be to actually create a world where everyone feels seen and valued for who they are, regardless of who they love.
I couldn't agree more. And on that note, we're going to leave you with one final thought to ponder today. If these rising interracial marriage rates tell us anything, it's that love truly does have this incredible power to transcend even the most deeply ingrained social boundaries. And honestly, that's something worth celebrating. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the Oxford study and interracial marriage trends. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for watching our video. I hope you liked it. And make sure you guys subscribe to this channel and watch all our other videos. Great news too. Every Monday, we'll be putting out a new weekly video. That's right, we've got educational seminars, street interviews, fun in-field pickup videos, and anything else we can come up with that's fun for you guys to watch. So check back.